Good morning, and I have to start by thanking you all for allowing me to speak English because my Italian is non-existent. And it's wonderful to have someone whispering translations in my ear. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be here on a very important occasion of the celebration of the existence of a journal. And I think in your introduction, you already raised a lot of concerns about you can say, the objectification of education. I think academic journals are really important because I would say themselves, they are educational projects. They try to create places where things can come to collective attention. But of course, the whole publishing industry has also become completely neoliberal. And I encounter those pressures also in my role as editor. And I know many people are under pressure even in relation to job security, where they just have to produce pieces that are published in so-called high-ranking journals. And I think that's really sad. And there is I think a real task for journals to keep their educational and scholarly mission central. And it's beautiful to see that that is still happening, I think, in many places. I never try to be a pessimist, although sometimes it's difficult when you wake up in the morning and look at this whole world and think what's going on. It's also quite interesting that the journal has an explicit phenomenological focus for a number of reasons. I'm originally from the Netherlands, and in addition to being famous for windmills and cheese, I think in some countries the Netherlands is known for the Utrecht School of Phenomenology, which I think during a couple of decades made quite a significant contribution, I think, to get a phenomenological approach into mainstream social science research. What I think was quite interesting about the Utrecht School was that it had an impact across a number of disciplines, but also was empirical in its orientation, not philosophical or theoretical, but it always wanted to look at what are the phenomena, what is actually happening, and how can we make sense of that if we pay respect to the phenomena themselves. I actually worked at Utrecht University, but when I was there, the Utrecht School was effectively demolished, I would say. By people who thought that the only real research would be quantitative, statistical, empirical research. And I still find that a silly idea. So it's remarkable that there are people who keep thinking that. And the way in which that was established in Utrecht also meant to really try to push out anything that had to do with phenomenology or interpretive research. Even as I said last night over dinner, for me that was eventually the reason to move to England, because the academic context in the Netherlands was one where theoretical and historical work was marginalized. Even though I was the person who published most in so-called high-ranking journals, but then suddenly that argument doesn't work if you publish the wrong kind of things. So that's all ironic and odd, but I have to say that in Britain, I found a much more open academic culture, and I still value that. I still don't understand how British universities work, because in the Netherlands, everything is very structured and regulated, and everyone is in charge of everyone else. And for me, that was sort of the mindset I had. And I still remember that I was sitting in my new office at the University of Exeter, and I was waiting for someone who was going to tell me what I should do. And that person never arrived. And that was so interesting that suddenly I realized, okay, so you have to do it yourself, and then you figure out how you organize that. So I tremendously value that. In other respects, the UK is in a mess, as you may have seen in the news, but there is a sense of academic freedom that is real and very different from many other countries. What more to say? I think also that phenomenology is an important inspiration in my own work. We spoke about that last night as well, also resemblances. Maybe the most recent link there is that I think that education, as distinguished from learning, education is given. And if there is any sort of philosophical school that understands the phenomenon of givenness, I would say it's phenomenology. So also for that reason, I keep coming back, because there is something fundamentally educational at the center of that. Then my talk for today. Yeah, we had some chats, and I'm meeting people, and they said, you said, I've read almost all of your work, and then I get very nervous because I think, have I got anything new to say, or should I have prepared something else? But I have what I have, and I'll take you through some of those ideas, which are indeed around a really important topic. And again, from your introduction, I think you set the scene really well. That are many developments in and around education, policy, practice, but also how that influences the self-understanding of what teachers do. That in a sense always distracts from what you would say education should be if it's a human endeavor. And I'll share some reflections on that, which are hopefully helpful to, for the further discussion and to focus the attention on a number of issues. And I have a PowerPoint with quite a lot of text, but I hope that also helps in the communication across languages. If my Italian is correct, then I see that in the title there is something about senso, which may be closer to meaning of education. Fini to me sounds like aim. And then there is also the word purpose. I have retitled my presentation, The Point of Education in an Age of Measurement, because I have encountered that when we only talk about the purpose or the aim, there are people who can quickly pull that back to an instrumental way of thinking, where they say, okay, we put a different purpose there, and then we gear the whole machinery towards that different purpose. And I think to talk about the point of education, to say why education, is maybe also an attempt to push back against people who say, tell me what your purpose is, and we'll do it effectively. So that's the reason why I wanted to make that. Now, what we are sort of responding to is what I call here a bit extreme, sort of a new global consensus that, again, you've already spoken about, and that I guess many of you will not just recognize, but probably you're also living in parts of this reality, as we all, I think, in education do. That the idea is that education is about effective production, which are already problematic terms of measurable learning outcomes, that we should do that through evidence-based interventions, that if we know how the brain works, then we will be saved forever. That the main ambition is to position a school system or a country high in particular rankings, which means that there is a need to control the whole educational endeavor, but also the mindset is one of competition. I keep coming at remarkable expressions of this idea. The recently disappeared Minister of Education in Australia, for example, held a speech, I think about 6 months ago, where he said the main ambition for all Australian education is to make sure that Australia ends up in the top 5 of best performing countries in the world. And I just don't understand that. I cannot understand how a teacher would go to work in the morning and think my job is to push Australia in the international rankings. So there is a huge disconnect between that kind of policy speak that then also says the way to do it is to get more evidence, more cognitive science, more simplistic basics of reading and mathematics. So it's a strange articulation of what should matter. And it's worrying that this is being circulated at level of policy. And there is, of course, the question, how is that possible? I am optimistic because I think as an educator, that's sort of a professional duty to never give up. And sometimes I also see some positive signs. A lot of my connections with policy and practice are in the Netherlands. The Dutch Minister of Education is doing exactly the same. He has a new master plan to sort out the basics. And of course, the basics are not democracy and sustainability, but reading and writing. And he says, in 10 years, we will have fixed this and we'll give all the schools money if they make sure they use a list of 10 evidence-based interventions. And of course, when money is attached, it's difficult for schools to say no. But I was quite encouraged that I saw schools who said we need to have a serious discussion amongst ourselves whether we want this money, because it comes with so much that goes against what we stand for, that we better say no to the money. I think that those little things are encouraging. And part of what I think we can do as scholars and academics is to be in those spheres and provide language and arguments and ways of seeing that support making the problems visible and articulating alternative ways of talking and doing. So some people get excited about this, but it keeps me reminding of a song by the Talking Heads, but that also says something about my age and generation, the song Road to Nowhere. And I wonder indeed whether those educational ambitions will lead somewhere. And there I think it's important that we are also bold in talking about different orientations, different purposes, different articulations of what the point of education is. And I think we need powerful language for that. One I really like is this summoning to say, as human beings, our main task is to try to be at home in the world. And to sort of position home and world there is to show what the challenge there is, and I'll speak to that. Also because I'm increasingly convinced that the world in some way should be in the center of the educational endeavors. And I want to share some thoughts about what I mean by that and how it might be helpful in navigating these complexities. I'll do that by going back to, you can say, the most important question we as educators should ask ourselves. Does what we do matter? And if we can't give an answer to that question, then we're in trouble. And if the only answer is, yes, most of our interventions are sort of for 60% effective, then I think we should also stop, because I think that's a kind of non-answer. It's actually quite odd that people find that satisfactory, that they say, if I take this intervention in my class, it will be 70% effective. Because I always tend to think our job as a teacher is to care for 100% of the students. So when you say it's 70% effective and therefore we should be using it, you forget the 30% of the students, if those percentages even work at that level, that actually need you as a teacher. So it's problematic then. One really interesting way into this question, I'm just sharing it because I find it clever at a number of levels. I found in a book by the German scholar Dietrich Benner. He has this huge book, Allgemeine Pädagogik, which he published for the first time, I think, in the late 80s. And it's now in its 7th or 8th edition because he keeps updating the book. I find that remarkable, that a scholar goes back to a book every 5 years and says, I need to change things because I now see it better or differently, or there are really black spots. So it's quite something that he does. He asks the question about, does education make a difference, in an interesting way, where he says, we know that human beings are natural beings, living beings, so there is a nature component. We know that human beings exist in environments, and those have a tremendous influence. That's the nurture component. And then he asks, and what about education? All this work we do as teachers and educators and pedagogues. And you can play with the figures. You can say, well, we should each have 1/3, but that's not how it works. And over time, you see discussions moving in different directions. There are times when people say it's really the environment. I think we're now moving much more in the direction where there are many loud voices that say a lot of it is genetic or it's hardwired in the brain. So it raises the interesting question, and there is something interesting about the question that I'll show in a minute. What is the percentage that the work of educators contributes there? Now, I want to go to that through 3 vignettes that I've also used in my latest book. One is this story, Rosa Parks, who in, I think, November 1953, boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, where there were signs all over in the bus, white forward, colored rear. And you made a story that when she was asked to move to the back of the bus, she refused to do so. Now, if you are concerned about literacy, and many politicians say they are concerned about literacy, and if you define literacy, which again I think many politicians do, as the ability to decode a written message, then you can say here is something strange happening because we have a woman, we have a written message, and for some reason Rosa Parks is unable to decode this message. So there you can say, if you take the narrow PISA look, this is a case of educational failure. And I have to say, when you read this speech or recent policy documents from Australia, reading is presented as the ability to decode a written message. That's all there is. Second vignette, this is Adolf Eichmann, who was responsible for the logistics of the concentration camps. And what is famous about his story is that he fled to South America, was taken back in the early 60s by the Israeli Secret Service, put on trial in Jerusalem. And when he was asked, Eichmann, are you responsible for the consequences of what you did? His answer was no, because I was only following the orders of my superiors. And again, if you take the simplistic look, which I encounter in educational policy and research, that citizenship is about following the rules of your society, then we have to say this is educational success. Here is someone who really knows how to obey the rules of society. There are more vignettes. I came across this very interesting statement by Zelensky, who early on in the conflict was offered to escape from the Ukraine. And he says, if I left Ukraine, I would be alive, but I would no longer be a person. And I think that's an interesting distinction he makes there. And it begins to raise, and that's what I'm working towards, to the whole question of what it actually means to exist as person, which is a very different question from the question of survival. And I do want to bring this other young person also into our minds again. Joshua Wong, who is currently imprisoned in Hong Kong because he spoke up for democracy. And I think it's, first of all, impressive that someone of his age was doing that, when I think how I was at that age, I was naive and nowhere, so I'm impressed by that. But it's of course also sad that someone like him ends up in prison. Back to Benner, because Benner gives a fantastic, remarkable answer to his own question, where he says we can disagree about the percentages, nature and nurture, but he says together nature and nurture are always 100%. And I find that, as I said, clever and fascinating. And the first time I read it, I thought, my German is also not as good as I thought it was. But the point Benner is making there is that he says, of course, as human beings, we're always the product of some kind of combination of the biological and the sociological, you could say, or the natural and the environmental. That makes us what we are at this point in time. And then Benner's point is, and I think he gets that absolutely right, is that he says education is concerned with a different question. Not the question how that mix works out, but the question how each of us can step forward as an I or a person, you can say, from that mix or with that mix. And there you can say he puts the question of our humanity and our human existence at the heart of education. And it's not just clever because it intervenes in an interesting way in many discussions about this. But what he also does is says education has its own question, which is not the question of biology or developmental psychology. It's not the question of social cultural studies. Those are respectable areas in their own, but they don't have the education question. And we can also not think that if we just apply knowledge from those other disciplines, then suddenly we are in education. Education has its own question and its own concern. You can say that that educational question is of a different order from the questions of psychology, biology, sociology, sociocultural theory. So just to make the point, you can say that Benner is arguing that the educational question is not this question how all these factors work out. He would probably go as far, but we can come back in discussion about that if you want to, that even how we can sort of influence these processes is not really our proper question. The real question is what Benner, with a nice German phrase, calls the task for educators is that of Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit, summoning to self-action, which is never to say to our students, be yourself, but it's to say to our students in all kind of direct and indirect ways, be a self, be a person, you could say. And that's what Zelensky was, I think, hinting at, where he was saying, yes, my survival would have been secured if I left the Ukraine, but I would have disappeared as a self, as a person. Some people don't like my work because they think it's far too theoretical, and they also always want to hear, but what should we do? And this, for me, is sort of the simplest way to say what's going on here, where I think as educators, we knock on the door of our students and we ask, is anyone there? That for me would be the shortest way to describe what the work of education is. And then, of course, we can add layers to it. But this is somewhere at the heart of it. And when you then look at Eichmann and Parks from this angle, you can see suddenly that it flips, because then Eichmann said, there is no one here. And Parks said, at this moment, I have to be here. I cannot simply obey these rules any longer because I believe they are wrong and they need changing. And I like that about these two vignettes, that they very quickly show that if you put the educational question on them, the reality looks completely the opposite than when you look at that in terms of simplistic literacy and citizenship education ideas. And of course, these are simplistic ideas. The good scholarship on literacy understands that to be literate is a political and an existential matter, not a decoding skill. And the good work on citizenship understands that that is also about political existence and not about having the civic skills, you could say. So that means that I think, and for me, that's important if we try to get to the phenomenon of education itself, that at the heart of it we find an existential question. And again, that helps in seeing how education is different from other disciplines and other discourse communities. Because this is not the question who we are, for which we have the word identity. It is the question how we are, how we try to live our lives, how we try to exist. So you can say it's not about how we become or what kind of identity we have or feel comfortable with or are aspiring towards, but it's always the question, what will I do with that? What will I do with what I've learned, with my capacities, my competencies? But when you ask that question, something else also comes into view, namely that as human beings, we also have our inabilities, our incompetencies, our blind spots. And I think that's remarkably missing in all these European competence frameworks that always think that if you have all the competencies, then you're there. But that's kind of an illusion at the horizon where we can never go. The question, what we will do, is sometimes a question where we are in control, but most of the time it's a question that we encounter. We encounter situations where it suddenly matters that I ask myself, what will I do? And again, Parks and Eichmann are interesting because they hint at those situations where suddenly you encounter this question. Should I move to the back of the bus? Should I say I was only following orders, or should I stand differently there? So there is little choice. And if the neoliberal universe is constantly telling us we have all the choice in the world and we are in control of our own choices, the existential question shows that that is a very limited view. I think if this is the educational question, then we also need to make sure that we have a different concept for that. And in my own work, I go back to the notion of subjectness. These words don't entirely work in English, but they don't work in many languages. But sometimes to have a word that doesn't fit entirely helps also to focus the attention and think, what are we trying to express there? It's about how we exist as subject, not as object. And again, I think you already identified many of the objectifying forces that constantly flow into education. So you can see the real tension there. If you want to put it on a t-shirt, I would do it like this, but not sure. The question of the I, but not the I interested in itself, but the I, you can say, that tries to be at home in the world, because that's the only place where we can exist. You can say whether we like it or not. And then we come back to education and ask if this is a legitimate or maybe the legitimate concern for education, if this is where the point of education is sort of to be found, is this question still in education? Has it still got a place there? Can it still be at home in education? And there, again, I share your concerns that a lot of what's happening in education is moving in the opposite direction. And you can say this existential question is constantly squeezed out. It's partly squeezed out by this global consensus, you can say, this idea that education's main business is to produce learning outcomes that then can be measured. And it's a very odd sort of loop that it's not just that the learning outcomes drive the measurement, but you will also see the measurement begins to drive what's being valued. Now, I think it's important to also understand where this is coming from. I think even when I speak to people who strongly believe in evidence-based education and school effectiveness, at some point they will say that they are motivated by social justice. They also want the best education for everyone. And I think it's good that we have that common ground, but I fear that the solutions at some point have become disconnected from that ambition, and that's the worry. But I again remain optimistic that if we go back to that common ground, it may be possible to work together. That's what I still hope for. That doesn't happen in the newspapers, but when you sit together over a cup of coffee, I have more interesting conversations, even with people like John Hattie. So you see a lot of the student, the subject, being squeezed out of education. Also, a very quick thing, I think there are also tendencies where it's no longer teachers that objectify students, but actually that students are asked to objectify themselves. Things I read and hear about self-regulation, about taking ownership of your own learning. They may sound progressive to some ears, but I often see that those become technologies of self-objectification, where we say to students, you need to become the manager of yourself. You need to see yourself as an object, and now you are the manager of that object. So I find that quite worrying, actually. But I have another worry as well, because this concern about the objectification of education is quite widely shared, and you see people pushing back along these lines, where they say we need to create opportunity, space for children and students to express their voice, to make their own sense, to be creative, generate their own meaning, articulate their own unique identity. And I see that in, you can say, old and new connections to forms of progressive or child-centered or student-centered education. I do a fair bit with people in the arts, and the arts are often seen as the solution for all the evils in education. And I call them expressivist because for me, one tendency in this is to say the school needs to be a place where children can express themselves in all kinds of ways. There are other languages, like they need to be able to develop all their talents. Flourishing is another concept that comes in. And the question that I often miss there is the what if question. what if the voice that is speaking is racist? What if the creativity wants to destroy? What if the identity is only interested in itself? And I'm surprised that this what if question is not asked as often as I think it should be asked, also around flourishing, for example. Because I think out of that question, we can get a sense of the real work we should do as educators, but I also think we are doing as educators. So I think the discourse about what's happening in schools doesn't match what I think a lot of teachers are actually doing all the time. Of course, there needs to be space for children and students to express, to discover, to articulate, to appear. But that can never be the end. The educational work is to raise the question whether what is emerging there in your own life and the lives of others is going to help with leading your life or is going to hinder, which is a normative question. And that's a question we cannot escape because the universe is constantly emerging in all kinds of ways. I think many educators know that question, but they have become, I think, quite afraid of it, partly because it's a normative question, but also because this normative question has often been played out in an authoritarian way, where the answers to this question were seen as the answers that educators need to give, need to tell students, you are good and you are bad. And I think the real educational work is to raise this question, but then to try to make that into a living question for our students, which is difficult work. There is no effectiveness there, but I think it's the existential work of education. That's again what you can hear in this idea of Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit, to say, make this your own question. Make sure that you stand in a relationship with what emerges rather than be determined by it. In my own work, I've been looking for language also to capture this. This is one phrase I came up with to say it's about arousing a desire in the new generation for wanting to exist in the world in a grown-up way. And there again, you see the world where you can say this is not curriculum-centered. It's not about what we put in our students. It's not child-centered. It's not about letting everything just flourish and blossom. But it's about meeting the world and, in a sense, trying to figure out your existence there. I'll say a few things to give that some filling, and then I'm heading towards the end of my talk. Are we okay with time? Yeah. So when you ask what it means to exist in the world, I think one really important experience there, you could even say this is part of you can call it a proto-phenomenology. You can say that existing in the world, encountering the world, means that you encounter resistance. So the simple idea is, and again, I take inspiration from Hannah Arendt, who says, as human beings, we are beginnings and beginners. We have the capacity to begin, even when we are born, but also in all our speech and action, there is something new emerging. But for that new to arrive somewhere, it has to meet the world. And there we will often find that the world is not that welcoming place that just says yes to everything that we want to initiate. So we can have a brilliant idea. I often talk about clay because I think it's an interesting example. You have a piece of clay and you have a brilliant idea in your head. And then you start and you begin to find out that the clay simply doesn't allow you to do that. So there you meet resistance. But of course, also when you're with friends and say, I have a brilliant idea, and all your friends look at you and they sort of say, no, we don't think that's that brilliant. That's a really important experience because it shows that the world is real, you could say, and not a construction. So that raises all kind of questions about the popularity of theories of constructivism in education. Um, it also explains why I really hate 3D printers, because they don't offer resistance to ideas and design, but that's a side point. Now, encountering resistance, you can say, is frustrating, and you can say, what do you do with that frustration? One thing you can do is that you use that energy to try to overcome the resistance. And sometimes that's really important to make something happen. So this is not a case for resignation. But there is always a danger that if we push too hard and if we go too far, that we destroy the very place where we try to arrive. So you can put a dramatic word destruction there. The other possibility out of that frustration is that you pull back, that you say, gosh, the world is far too difficult for me, I can't cope with it. Now, sometimes that's important so that other things can happen. But there is always the danger that if you go back too far, that you destroy, you can say, your possibility to exist in the world. And there you can begin to see that the whole question of existing in the world has at its limits two places of non-existence, where either the world is destroyed or the self is destroyed. And then you can say, what does it mean to exist in the world? That is to try to stay somewhere in this strange middle ground between world destruction and self-destruction. Um, and you can say this language is extreme, but I think it's also quite accurate in order to describe what the educational space is. Precisely the space of the world, the space where you realize that the world is real, maybe that the world is trying to tell you something in response to your own initiatives and ideas, and that this challenge to try to stay in this middle ground is not just a challenge for children, it's actually a lifelong challenge. I think it's the only lifelong challenge. I'm not a fan of lifelong learning, but that's maybe another discussion. And I think it would be lovely if a school would be so courageous to say, this is a place where we try to help you to stay in the difficult middle ground between world destruction and self-destruction. But most schools, no, I shouldn't be too negative, but I see too many schools that tell a very rosy picture that's not true. Like, if you come here, we will help you to develop all your talents or for you to flourish completely. And I think it misses the difficulty that these words actually try to denote. That has something to do, and in a sense, it's the same point with this idea of grown upness, again, which is a very difficult concept to find a good word for. But I think it's another notion that is at home in education, and I think nowhere else. But grown upness and many words in other languages, they always suggest there is a kind of developmental trajectory, and at the end of it, you're fine. I think we need to think of that also existentially, and Philippe Mérieux, French scholar, has a beautiful phrase where he says, it's to be in the world without being in the center of the world. And that comes back to the whole question of desires, where you say it's to live with this question, whether what you desire, what you encounter in yourself as a desire, is what you should be desiring. If you're just, you can say, driven by your desires, then you can say you do not exist in relation to your desires. That's an interruptive question because it interrupts desires, it interrupts the being with oneself, it interrupts identity and fantasies about identities. It interrupts everything. And again, I like that because that's where education is. It's not in a kind of Newtonian universe. It's somewhere else in how we exist. This is never about getting rid of our desires. And again, there is old pedagogy that says desires are the problem. And if we can liberate you from your desires, then you will be fine or in heaven. The question is to find the desires that help you to stay in the world. So this is just some additional language to try to capture what this challenge of existing in the world in a grown-up way, what that actually means or signifies. And I was quite happy that I once was in a conversation with the professor of evidence-based education in the Netherlands, and she had listened to a talk of mine, and she says, yes, I now understand that the educational challenge is to stay in the middle ground between world destruction and self-destruction. And it was just fantastic to see that language coming from her mouth. So I think this language really matters. Now, we know that there are a lot of objectifying forces in and around and going through education, and that can make us pessimistic or even desperate. And you can say one response is to say we need to change the system. We need to have a radical overhaul. We need to begin again. The problem is that that's not going to happen. So I think if we can find some optimism, it can also be found in looking much better at what is actually happening in education and what kind of qualities that are there can be enhanced and be brought to attention. And maybe both is needed, but I think it will take ages before we will, get rid of OECD or not sure what is needed. But in the meantime, there are qualities that are in front of us as phenomena, you could say, that where we can say those matter. And I think teachers sort of know that and can do something with that if we can help each other to highlight them. So education is interruptive, and I think that's really important to understand that education is not just to let everything flow, but to bring in these little moments of resistance. Not to destroy, but you can say to raise the attention in particular directions. That's what a good curriculum should do, in a sense. We have to be aware that not any interruption is educational. So there is always the question for us as educators to see what should be interrupted in such a way that it actually focuses the attention on the challenge of existing in a grown-up way. You can say it's opening up a space where the eye of the student can enter, can step forward. And I think there are many little moments in everyday school life where actually that happens. The challenge is to get attention for that and also to evaluate it in a positive way. I also think that here we find a completely different way to talk about equality and equality of opportunities. Because the appeal to be an I, to not forget yourself, is, you can say, an invitation, if we use a soft word, or a demand for all of us in equal measure. That doesn't mean that we will all exist in the same way, but it's a very different way to get into the whole question of equality, equal opportunities, and I think social justice. Because the problem with many of those discourses is that they have also been eaten up by an objectifying educational logic. So I think there is an opening there. The other quality for this kind of work is that these are slow processes, and that we have to understand that part of the point of education is precisely to slow down, to make time, to provide space, to create forms where students can meet the world, can meet themselves, and can get into this discovery of the destructive sort of horizons and the challenge to find an existence in the middle ground. Spivak has this nice phrase where she says, this is the educational work. It's where we meet our desires and begin to rearrange them to figure out which of those will help and which will hinder. She says it's a non-coercive rearrangement. If the coercion comes from the teacher, then I would say that's not the coercion we need. But it doesn't mean that there is nothing at stake. You can say our very existence in the world is at stake. So it's urgent in that sense. I know educators who understand that education needs its own time, and Korczak and A.S. Neal are wonderful examples, who know that you need to give so much time up to the point where the student will realize, okay, I need to be here. It's not the teacher or the system that can do the work for me. And I think the third quality is a word I've fallen in love with, sustenance, which means both support and nourishment. And I think that if we understand that our work as educators is to try to hold our students in that middle ground so that they can figure out what it means to exist there, they need the support and the nourishment in order to stay there. Often because what they encounter there will be difficult and unattractive in the short term, but always with the hope that in the longer term, there is something of value to be discovered there. And to say that interruption and suspension and sustenance are important qualities is important to say because there is a trend that goes in the opposite direction and says, the faster education goes, the more individualized it is, the least interruptive it is, the better it is. And I think that misses the existential point of education. And then I come back to the almost final question. Is there still time for these qualities? Is there still time, you can say, for the time of education, or with this nice thing that we should also keep reminding ourselves of, that the Greek word school actually means free time. Not sort of leisure time in the neoliberal sense, but time that hasn't got an agenda, the time we make available precisely to encourage the new generation to step into the world. And if the school is only driven by functional agendas, then that time is no longer the time of the school. So if we talk about education and emancipation, we can also ask maybe the school needs to be emancipated in our time, because the school has, the time of the school has been made too functional, you could say. And I play with that in my latest book, where I say, very often we ask this question, what kind of school does society need? But when you turn it around and say, what kind of society does the school actually need to be an educational place and not just this smooth function? I think that's a really important question to speak back. And then another bigger theme in my own work, the final question is education and all of this a matter of understanding? Is it about helping our students to make sense, to ask what does it mean, how can I make sense of it? There is something there, but again, I come back to Hannah Arendt, who writes about understanding and gives a very strange definition of understanding, where she says, let's see understanding as an unending activity by which in constant change and variation, we come to terms with and reconcile ourselves to reality, that is, try to be at home in the world. And I find it quite fascinating that she takes the word understanding and says understanding is actually not a a cognitive challenge, it is an existential challenge. And for me, that helps because I think that in a lot of education, we are focused very much on the question how students can make sense of the world, how we can make sense of our students, how students can learn about the world and do that better. And in that gesture, I think another gesture is often forgotten, namely that the world is not just there as a thing for me to make sense of, but that the world is also asking something of me, is trying to say something to me, is perhaps trying to teach me. And for me, those two gestures need to both have a place in education, so that we can return the educational question not just as a question of sense making and learning, but also as a question of being taught, which is, I think, the point of the rediscovery of teaching as well. And there again, you begin to see that despite everything we would like to happen, there is a world there that puts something on our life journey. So, to summarize, stop making sense in education and get a life. That's roughly to summarize, for which I took quite a long time. Thanks for your attention. I do want to mention that I've written far too much about all these things, that it's fantastic that so much of this work is being translated into Italian, and that we were talking last night and say, yes, we have the title of the seminar today, and that's the only book that still is not going to be translated in Italian, but maybe this is an occasion for doing that. Or the book is too old, but I think that the topic and the question is still very relevant. So thanks very much.